At Nonprofit New York, we are proud to offer dozens of learning opportunities each year, all selected and curated to give our members and non-members alike a firm grasp of the fundamental concepts of our key areas of nonprofit excellence, one of which is human resources. That is why I am happy to be welcoming you to today's session, How to Find and Recruit Great Talent, presented by Jessica Gem of Gem Consulting, and in partnership with Con Edison. So with that, I would like to pass it to Ulysses Eiffel from Con Edison to welcome you today and tell you a little bit more about our presenter. Thank you, Ulysses.
Thank you, Darby, and good morning, everyone. I hope you've got your water bottles nearby and a snack with you. We're excited to be here. So my name is Ulysses Eiffel. I work at Con Edison. I've been here almost going on 8 years soon. My role here at the company is all things employee engagement. So I'm happy to be here in partnership with Nonprofit New York to bring you this great workshop. So we're here with Gem Consulting. We're here with Jessica, who will be presented by Jessica Gem. She is a coach and talent strategy consultant who is dedicated to helping individuals, teams, and organizations reach their full potential, performance, and passion. She spent over 10 years inside the nonprofit sector as a fundraiser, policy liaison, human resources director, recruiter, team leader, trainer, and facilitator. Over the last decade, she has worked as a consultant providing strategic HR and talent support to nonprofit organizations, and as a coach working with exceptional leaders and teams. As a coach, Jessica works directly with individual clients on their goals, both professional and personal. She specializes in partnering with people facing transitions in their lives, such as in a new role, increased leadership demands, and career transformations. In her consulting work, she engages in projects including culture development, HR strategy, team facilitation, change management, and leadership development. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Jessica Gem. Thank you.
Thank you, Ulysses. I appreciate the introduction and sharing a lot of my background. It's nice to be with you all this morning. So I will start off today with sharing a little bit extra about my background too, in addition to what Ulysses shared, just to kind of give you some context, particularly as we talk about recruiting and finding great talent today, because that will be our focus. And then I'll kind of frame what our session's going to be, and we'll dive right in and cover lots of good ground in the next 90 minutes here. While I'm doing my intro, I would love for the folks who have joined us to just put your name and your name is on the screen, but put your role in your organization in the chat, so I have a sense of who is here and what kind of roles you play in your organizations. So if you would go ahead and just share your role in your organization, that would be really helpful for me. And so just a little bit of extra context about my background. So Ulysses covered a lot of the ground of what I've done in my career. As we talk about recruiting in particular, I wanted to kind of, give you a little context of where I'm coming from sharing this information. So I have been, in my former role running HR for this national nonprofit that was based in DC, we grew really quickly. So in the 4 years I was in that position, we went from 30 people to 120 or so around the country. And I think there were 11 different offices at that point, including, one in New York City. So we had to grow pretty considerably and, had sort of normal turnover during that time too. So, we're talking, it was a great learning experience to figure out what worked and what didn't work in terms of, recruiting and hiring, and particularly finding people who fit the culture and helped the organization and the culture grow over time, but really kind of keeping an eye on not just getting, warm bodies and seats, but being thoughtful about who we were bringing on too. So just have a lot of repetition through that process, particularly thinking about how we build culture through hiring. And then as a consultant in the last more than a decade, I have led recruiting and executive search efforts for nonprofits all over the country, from large hospital systems to, 3-person organizations. And so I've, continued to keep my pulse or my finger on the pulse of what's happening in hiring. And in fact, for one of my consulting clients right now, I'm leading another search process, and know that particular challenges of this moment in time, have hired people during the pandemic for virtual environments as well as in person, and just kind of giving you a sense of kind of that perspective as well. So I like to come to these kinds of sessions with a lot of shortcuts that I can share with you so that you don't have to recreate the wheel, particularly those of you who might wear multiple hats, because I know that it's not easy to balance things like hiring with your actual job. And that a lot of organizations in particular are struggling right now with finding the right folks. So today's session, we are going to cover a couple of frameworks and some best practices I've found or developed over the years. I will not be using PowerPoint today. That's not my favorite. So I will share with you as we go along. I'll sort of bounce back and forth from being on your screen here to sharing the worksheets that you'll have access to after completing your evaluation, that you can take and adapt and use in your organization. That will be sort of the way that we'll work through a lot of this material today, because I think it's very important for you to have something to walk away with. So today we will be focusing on first talking about the mindset that we might need to shift in recruiting in the nonprofit sector. It's, I think there can be a lot of sort of tendencies that we have as a sector that aren't serving us very well. So we'll talk about some of those and then shift into some of the tools to help you think through what the needs are at this moment in time and how to think about actually selling those out in the market for talent, because it is a hot market right now for sure. But even when it's not quite so hot, it's still an important thing to do. And then as we go along here, certainly I will be working to highlight some different ways that you can incorporate diversity, equity, and inclusion practices in your hiring process. I think a lot of us have done a lot of work over the last couple of years in particular, but I just want to make sure that that's a highlight of what we're talking about as well, because this is one of the most important places to have some of these conversations and to put some structures in place so that we're mindful of DEI practices as we go along here. So thank you for sharing a little bit about yourselves. The other thing I would just welcome, because we're a pretty small group here too, as we go along here. So you are more than welcome to put your questions in the chat as we go. At each, there's sort of 4 sections that I'll be covering. So at the end of each section, I'll also just pause. And if you'd like to unmute and ask a question, that is fine as well, because we're, I think, a pretty manageable size to do that. But feel free to track questions in the chat, and I will do my best to get back to those. And I know the team here will also help me make sure I don't miss questions. So if you feel like I missed something, just make sure you raise your hand, flag me or something. And we will jump right in. And the other thing I would love to kind of get going in the chat too, as we get started here, is hearing a little bit, and you can unmute yourself as well or put it in the chat. I would love to hear about what you're looking to get out of today's session, or a particular challenge that you're having right now with recruiting, or that you've had in the past year. So would love to hear a couple of you share in particular what you're hoping to get out, so I can make sure that we try to tackle some of those issues. See, we've got some board members, we've got some executive directors, some HR managers and directors, program managers. So we've got a good range of folks here. I'm sure all of you are deep in this process. Nice to have you here. Anyone want to be brave and take themselves off mute and share what you're hoping to get out of this session? Or you need more coffee this morning, that's okay too. Well, we'll keep an eye on that as we go forward here. So what I will do is just jump into sharing a couple of guiding principles with you. I think that these are things that are going to be really, helpful in shifting sort of that mindset piece about how recruiting is working or not working for you. So the first and most important thing is probably just to take the time to step back from the day-to-day. And I know that that can be a lot to ask with how much everyone has going on in their organizations and, often being short-staffed. So everything I'm sharing with you is with the knowledge of kind of what your day-to-day is really like. I have been there. I know what that's like. And I think that one of the biggest things that often happens in a recruiting process is, somebody leaves the organization. Maybe it's someone who's been there for a really long time, and we panic and just, take their job description and run and post it. And that is, speedy, but it's not necessarily going to be the right solution. And so taking some time, and it doesn't need to be a lot of time, but like taking a moment to actually pause and consider, what the needs are before we go out and try to find a person is really important. Another aspect that I also just like to highlight is that we often, can get into a self-critical space about our organizations or feel like things are not working. And so what I want to frame for you is to work towards a strengths-based mindset of, we're going to understand what the gaps are in the organization, but it's also important to use anytime there's a recruiting opportunity as a time to consider how we might tap into the strengths and skills of our existing team members. Not to overburden them with more work, but just to think about, to think creatively about how we can fill the gaps that we have with our existing team. And that's, a kind of secret way of keeping your team feeling engaged and, like that their work continues to be meaningful over time. And then the third thing I'll just share is, that we have this tendency in our sector to have a scarcity mindset. This is true in fundraising, when we're not asking for what we fully need. And often it comes up in hiring processes when we say like, we can't afford another person, or, the board only approved a 0.3 FTE, so we can't actually meet the needs of what our constituents have. And I think that it's really important on a couple of levels, one for us to remember the impact that we're having, and to present that as an exciting opportunity in the marketplace. Like we're not just shoving a job description out there, but we're setting ourselves apart from the other jobs that are out there too. And it's an opportunity to, mindfully engage the leadership and the board in conversations, even with foundations and funders. Like we have some funders on this call, right? And they need to understand the full cost of doing business and not just sort of scrimping and saving when it comes to people, because, those solutions are not long-term sustainable for organizations. And so that's just, that's a longer term change, right, that we're trying to make in the sector as a whole. But it is something that I really like to highlight when I do these trainings, because I think we often can feel stuck that we don't have the ability to hire a full-time person. We don't have the ability to take some of the stress off our team. But I really think it's important to try to shift our mindset to a place of really seeing ourselves as advantaged in this space of hiring. So those are a couple of mindset shifts that I think are important for us to keep in mind as we go into this this process and the tools and frameworks I'll share with you. I saw one comment in the chat about trends about how to navigate hybrid work environments. Happy to share about that. I think there are some interesting creative things we can kind of talk about there. And I've got, let's see, another one, person who's hoping to get some strategies and resources for engaging and re-engaging staff. So yeah, particularly in these very challenging times, I think it's a great mindset also to walk into, as I said, this kind of process of hiring is really thinking about how do we engage our current team and not just like shove them to the side while we're focused on bringing somebody new in. So let's dive right into some of these things, and feel free if there's other things if you that you're looking to have us touch on, pop those in anytime. So the 4 parts that we'll be covering today. So the first step is talking about assessing our current state. So what are the strengths? What are the gaps? And then we'll jump into how do we define the role that we have, not just what it might have looked like before when someone else was in a similar role, but what is actually needed now. And then the third area we'll talk about is how do we actually define your culture? And I think to that point of how do we talk about a hybrid work environment, this is an important thing, most especially to like really talk about what it looks like now. And then the fourth area that we'll start, we'll get into is how to actually find people. And I, will predispose you that I don't have magic bullets here. This is not like, there's one secret job site that you can find all the best people on, but we'll talk about some creative ways to find people, and then how to actually process folks through interviews and get a sense of who they are as best you can through that kind of process. So those are the four areas we'll talk through. And, just to reiterate, so like, as you can get a sense, the more time that you spend upfront getting it right, getting a clear sense of what the role is, who you're looking for, the more successful your process will be. And again, it doesn't have to take a lot of time, but it just, it does require stepping back and doing some of that assessment and thinking, and it requires a little time to get the right kind of inclusion of the rest of your team. So to the point of how do you actually engage your staff? This is a great way to engage your staff, is by getting their input on the process of who you're looking for and what the day-to-day work really looks like. And the reason we're going to start with the process of assessing the current team in this first section is to make sure that we're aware of the resources that we already have available to us. And as I mentioned, staff want to grow and take on more responsibility. Like, people usually want to feel a sense of progress in their work. It's not true for 100% of people, but most people do want to do that. And people who join us in this sector want to have that sense of impact. And so it can be, this is an opportunity to really think about, how you can be creative, especially if you don't have a large organization, you don't have a ladder for them to climb, but, you need to be more creative about how you give people more responsibility. So I will share my screen with you here as I talk through this next part. So the first thing that I really, recommend doing, and this is, I'll show you the worksheet in a moment, but kind of show you how I visually represent this too, is really to kind of do a quick org chart, to kind of chart out your team, and with the actual, the seats on your team. So I will go ahead and share this window here, and if you can just, somebody can give me a thumbs up that you can see this. Okay, that would be helpful. Okay, thank you, Darby. So this is like my example of, here's our current state. You can see it's a pretty small organization. So you start off with just kind of noting, who is on your team, what positions may need to evolve in the future, whether that's right now or otherwise. And what is going on in this particular moment with the people in these seats or the positions themselves. So you can see I've noted a couple of things in red here. So the program manager is somebody we've highlighted as, we want to make sure we're engaging them so they feel excited to stay here, right? Like maybe they're a little bit of a flight risk or something like that. The communications person, just to note, like, they're okay, but like, that's probably not either the right person or not the right position for us. Noting that the office manager, maybe has been doing a lot of administrative work, is showing some interest in HR, or we have some need around, taking on some HR responsibilities. And then noting like the program associate is maybe not the right set of responsibilities for our program team, right? So this is just a quick kind of snapshot of what's going on in the current team. And so when you have someone who leaves, or you have the opportunity to add a new position, this is something I recommend to my clients to just spend some time really thinking about the big picture, not just the one opportunity that you have. Because sometimes we can find these creative ideas for how different things might fit together. So in this process, the worksheet that I'll show you as well, we're noting what might be missing on the team. Are there some skill sets that are missing? And I'll show you that sort of what that next stage looks like of identifying some of the needs, right? So in blue here, you can see, we may need some higher level finance skills. Maybe the development director is so stretched and, is really great at engaging people. And so what we'd love to do is outsource the grant writing, because that's taking them away from actually being able to meet with donors. We have some other notes here about, maybe some coaching for the program manager would help to keep them engaged. Thinking about realigning the program associate with some other kind of skill set, like a social work intern or someone from an AmeriCorps program, adding some HR responsibilities with some training to the office manager, rethinking this communications role maybe as more of a development support position, right? So this is just a way of identifying some of the gaps and some of the needs that, either we can help our current team build, or we can, look at how we might reframe some of these positions. To consider, how we can really strengthen the team in some creative ways. And I think that this is, often an example of where you might find in an organization that, like, you don't need to go hire a whole separate HR person. You might just need to sort of look at the office manager's responsibilities and see if we added a development support person, they could provide some of that administrative support that the office manager has been doing, which would free them up to do some of those HR responsibilities, right? So when you're looking at the big picture here, you can kind of have that perspective on, your whole team and be thinking about things like a retention plan for your program manager, whatever the case might be. So I will stop sharing this particular example and just shift over to the worksheet so you can see what this looks like. And this is, what you'll be getting once you fill out the evaluation. It'll be either in Google Doc or Word format, so you can adapt it and use it yourself. But you can see this is the example I just showed you that gives you some prompts to think through, what are my current roles? What are the changes? What do we need to be aware of, and what's missing? I am just going to stop sharing there for a moment. And just, one other thing I will note is, when we go through recruiting processes, it often is one of these times where we notice what else is missing on our team from a diversity standpoint. And so, that's something I want to call out, because sometimes, it is unspoken if we look at the leadership team of an organization and they're, all white or something like that. And, just noticing that, that difference or that lack on our team doesn't mean that we're going to suddenly fix all of the problems with diversity, equity, and inclusion in terms of, filling one hiring opportunity. And so, the work that we do to incorporate diversity, equity, and inclusion in hiring practices is ongoing and is long-term work, as I'm sure all of you know. That there isn't a shortcut. We can't just sort of like hope to, make our team look more diverse just because we notice that's a need. That requires the investment in the culture and really sort of unpacking, what's going on in the organization to have gotten it to that kind of place. So, so that's something I like to mention, because I think that often comes up, with folks I talk to, and we can't just, fix all the problems with one hire. So why don't I pause there too and just see if you have questions about this first part about assessing the team. You can either unmute yourself or pop your question in the chat. And then we'll move on shortly to talking about defining the role, but invite your questions about this stage. Does this make sense as a process for you? Do you see that? How you would apply it for your organization? Yeah, I've got suggestions for how to get boards and supportive strategies that help with retention, recruitment, etc. Especially for small organizations. Yes, I am happy to speak to that. There is data out there, and I probably haven't refreshed it in a couple of years, but the cost of replacing a hire is double the salary you're currently paying. I think that's probably, stayed pretty constant just because, not only when you lose somebody, do you have to pay more for the next person, especially in a market like this? But it takes, months to find the right person. It takes months for that person to get up to speed. So, we're talking usually like 6 months to a year to really have a functioning person back in that position. So sometimes I think with boards, it can help to remind them about that kind of detrimental impact and how that's going to affect your ability to provide services in your communities. And boards, are made up of people who usually work in other places, right? And they, have some familiarity with the dynamics at play. But in particular, helping them to understand some of the trends around, around inflation and how that's affecting the bottom line as well. I think there's a lot of talk about sort of the quiet resignations and all of that happening, which, isn't necessarily, an epidemic, but is just, often a factor of employers not really caring about their employees, right? And sort of engaging them in a way that is, too transactional. And in this sector in particular, I think that's a huge challenge that we have, that, we generally do care about the people who work for us. We care about the work that we do. But I think that can be a really helpful, honest conversation to have with the board about, here's what we've heard from our team about what they would really feel is meaningful to them. So those are some things as you kind of look over your team, like kind of consider it a little retention project, like that this person would like to grow in this area, or investing a little bit in professional development, finding some pro bono coaching or something like that. All of those things you can be really creative about responding to what your staff are actually interested in, not just, saying, hey, we need to throw some money at the problem. So I think that being more proactive about that is going to benefit you and your organization. And I don't generally like to get into like scare tactics with folks, but I was working closely with an organization where the staff unionized. And I don't think unions are like good or bad necessarily, but it creates an interesting complication in the nonprofit sector with a much higher cost. And so, I think that when we're not careful about what our current staff are saying or really listening to them, sometimes it can head in a direction where it kind of gets out of our hands in terms of, choosing the path forward that we want, or that, that we can sort of reasonably afford as an organization too. So I think it's just important for boards to, have some awareness of, the potential consequences of, ignoring these issues. So that's a longer answer there, but I'm happy to share more about that too. Like someone's chiming in the chat, they love the idea of doing assessment of current positions, something they have had to do every couple of months. Yeah, that's a great, this is a great habit to get into for sure. Often when I do a retention workshop, we sort of talk about doing something like this quarterly, depending on the size of your team, so that you have a pulse of how people are really feeling. So I think that's a great idea. All right, I will jump into the next section. So we'll talk about how do we actually, move from this process of assessing the team to defining the role that we're actually going to hire for. And so, what I mentioned at the beginning is going to be the anchor here. It's really important not just to repost somebody's old job description, because a job description is actually an HR document that is meant to set expectations for what we want our staff to do. It is not a hiring tool. It is not a marketing document. It is meant to be long and boring and no fun to read, right? It has 50,000 bullets, everything possible that we might want that person to do, plus other duties as assigned, right? That is not a compelling thing to read in a job posting. So I want you to shift your thinking about away from this sort of job description mindset to really considering what is the role that we need now. And then we'll talk about kind of how to create that as a marketing tool to make it more compelling. This is not, my own idea. This is certainly something that lots of folks out there are, being creative about things now. But I think in particular, it's important for us to be realistic about the jobs that we are looking to hire for. I will use an example as we go along here too. I think a development director is an example where there's usually a lot of turnover. I think the average time that people stay in those positions is somewhere between 18 months and 2 years, which is, that's just kind of crazy, right? That we have folks turning over so frequently in a position that is so critical to the organization. So we'll talk about some of the reasons for that, as we get into defining the role clearly. So and there are a couple of things I will highlight as we get in here too, but I will go ahead and share my screen and kind of talk through this. So that you can kind of follow along here. So this first step is sort of thinking about how do we clarify the role? How do we evolve maybe an existing role to meet the needs that we have now or what's coming in the future? So if you've done strategic planning, if you have some grant funding that's come in that is taking you in a particular direction or helping you expand or go deeper in certain areas, I think it's really important to stop and think about, if it was a previous role, are there some elements that, that person was able to bring together that is actually going to be a unicorn if we go out and look for that person again? And this is an example of the development director role that I think is really, a common one that we find is that we see that role as often someone who we ask to go out and meet with donors, and they need to be, personable and like making asks and have sort of a sales mindset almost. They need to be a great grant writer. So they need to be really good with lots of minute details and following specific process and telling stories in writing. Oh, and then also they need to plan events, and that requires managing a lot of logistics and vendors and like running around, a chicken with their head cut off right on the day of, coordinating lots of folks. So you can imagine the way that I'm describing this, that these are three responsibilities that we often task a development director or manager with that don't have a lot of overlapping skill sets. So when we talk about elements of roles that don't fit together, or that maybe one person was able to do, when we go out to find something in the future, we really need to be mindful of what makes sense in a human being, right? Not a unicorn. We're looking for human beings here. So, so this gets into the second question of how do we actually summarize the top responsibilities of the role? Now, I would love to limit you to 3. But, this is a really important thing, kind of going back to the assessment, is considering, what is the stake in the ground that you are going to put for this position? If the development director could only spend their time doing one of those 3 things I mentioned, meeting with funders, writing grants or getting out and doing events, which is the most important for your organization? And the answer is different for different organizations, right? It's not to say the other things might not need to happen, but I think it's really important to ask this question so that you're able to have a clear sense of the person that you are looking for and what you're going to expect them to do. So, a lot of times we are understaffed, we are wearing multiple hats in nonprofits. But, we do have the ability to be thoughtful about what we say no to. Often fundraising events do not net very much money for the amount of work that is put in. So are there some things we need to say no to? Are there some ways we could, outsource some things so that the person, in the actual role is not actually stretched too thin? So this is, probably the most important part of defining the role is really having some discussions internally, talking to the people who are on the ground doing this work and getting a really clear sense of what they need this person to do. How is that going to complement the rest of the team? How are they going to lead a team to do that? But this is probably the most important thing, is get really clear on what the role is really about. And it cannot be about everything. It cannot be a list of 20 responsibilities, thinking about big buckets of responsibilities, that is. So, that's what I really want to encourage you to start with, because I think this is one of the best ways that you can help define the role so that people self-select in to the position, as opposed to feeling like, I don't know really what they're wanting. And I don't even know if I can be successful because they're asking for so much. So that's something I really hope you walk away with today. And then as we get into some of these other questions, we're shifting gears from thinking about this as a job description to thinking about this as a profile, or an ideal candidate profile. And this is what makes it more of a marketing document. And I will show you an example as we get through here too of what I have created, which you can sort of use as inspiration as well. But the idea behind the profile is, this is how we are describing us as an organization. So our culture, which we'll get into next, and this role to people who are outside. So we cannot use jargon. We cannot use acronyms. We can't assume that people know who we are or know what this role is. Let's talk about how we can translate it to people who may not know our organization, or maybe not even know the nonprofit sector. Maybe they're like looking to have more meaning in their life from coming from another place. And, this is your opportunity to explain what a program manager really does, for example. So as we get into, we have this sense of, here's our stake in the ground of what this role is about. Then we're going to talk about what are the profile qualities that we are going to look for in order to find the right person. And when I talk about profile qualities, this is getting us away from focusing too much on qualifications and other requirements. Like a bachelor's degree is, has become so common in our job descriptions or our job postings. But in reality, for most positions, we don't really need a bachelor's degree. And so that is one, little thing we can do in our job postings to introduce more equitable hiring practices. So you can, ask for a bachelor's degree or equivalent work experience, or something like that, or you could just take out that requirement altogether. It doesn't make a big difference. It's been a sort of quick shorthand for those of us doing recruiting to say, oh, that person, has done college level work. So they can probably do, the writing and thinking that we need them to do here. But in reality, there are many ways of developing those skills, right? So, so that is one thing, that instead of having the emphasis on qualifications or a certain number of years of experience, we're really just thinking about the kinds of qualities or the experiences that they have had, not like 7 years experience as a development director, right? That's not clear enough of what we're looking for. So I'll give you a couple examples here, but I think that what we want to show here is what we really value in the position. So you're going to have to get a little bit more creative about it and think about what, how to describe that to someone who's outside your world. So the examples I've given here, so if your organization has a need to build a bunch of things, like you want someone who's excited about doing that and not overwhelmed by it, someone who's sought out those kinds of opportunities and, has taken something from an idea to implementation, which is a very different person than someone who is really great at maintaining an already effective system or, helping to tweak it and improve it, and those are both great sets of people, but you need to be clear about which one is the right fit for this role or for your organization. And as we've sort of continued with this development director role, what is related to what is the most important part of the role? Do you need someone who is a great connector and relationship builder who loves making an ask, like not just someone who likes being friends with people, but someone who is kind of fearless, and is persistent and not afraid to like have someone say no. That's what you want if you want them to focus on engaging individual donors, for example. Versus, and you want someone to be really an event planner and managing highly detailed projects, highly complex, input scenarios, or do you need a grant writer who, is probably more introverted and likes being behind their computer, working on a lot of detail. So you can see through some of these profile qualities, like pick the one that is most relevant for the role, is very important. And these are great things that your team can give input on as well. So as we talked about team engagement, making sure that the team is giving input. So here's what the role is about. What do you think is the kind of person, what kind of experience would be really valuable to have in this new person? And then the last thing, I've touched on this a little bit, is talking about what resources you have to work with. So to the point of the 0.3 FTE that sometimes gets approved in a budget, that's not an actual person. Like we don't have a third of a person. While there are many people who might be looking for a part-time gig and sort of putting multiple things together, that's not the ideal scenario. So what I encourage organizations to do is really shift the thinking from that kind of FTE mindset to like, let's look at the dollars you have to work with. So even if that's just is what it is for your budget this year, let's be creative about how we're going to fill these needs. So sometimes, the role that you might have identified or the need that you identified through your assessment is actually more of a short-term project-based opportunity that would be great for a consultant or a freelancer. Or that it's going to take more than you have in your budget to hire a full-time person. So is there a way that you can fill that gap with, a really experienced volunteer, who effectively acts like a staff person while you're waiting to raise the funds to be able to hire the right kind of person? I think it's really okay to take your time, even though we always feel this pressure to get the right person in right away. So often this is something I just like to highlight too, that, sometimes in an executive director transition, it's better to think about having the resources to bring in an interim ED for, 6 months to a year to give you some time to find the right person and not sort of jump right into a hiring process. And that often also gives, staff a great way of engaging meaningfully around a succession planning process, if any of them are interested potentially in that position. So that could be a whole other workshop on its own, but I do just like to highlight that. I think, sometimes this conversation about resources is really worth having at a board level too, about, we have these resources available, what makes the most sense to do with them, even if it's an interim solution. And especially in this hiring environment right now, I know for the organization I'm working with, trying to find a development director right now is very difficult. We don't have a lot of applications and we're, doing tons of outreach as well. But, looking at a plan B of, what are some interim solutions, we might be able to use those same resources to kind of fill the gap until we're able to find the right person. So I'm going to pause there, get some water and just see. Feel free to unmute or pop your questions in the chat about defining the role. I know that was a lot of information to take in too. So feel free to jump in. I will say to the person who was asking about how to, re-engage staff, on a small team, this is a great thing sometimes just to sit down and have a conversation with your staff about the sort of overall how things are going, and what needs do they see, what solutions do they see. I think that's one of the things that can make staff feel most engaged is being asked their opinions and having that opinion actually taken seriously, because they're the folks who see what's going on in a different way than you do. So I definitely encourage you as you go through these processes to, you don't need to be overly formal about it, but to find those opportunities to just sit down with the staff and ask them, what do you think would help at this moment? Is this the best use of our time and resources? I don't see any questions coming in, but feel free to add them as we go. So we've talked about the profile, we've talked about defining the role. So the next step is to start defining the culture. And so I've mentioned a couple times, right? This is one of the ways that we can set ourselves apart from other jobs that are out there, from other jobs people hear about, right? Is the opportunity to have an impact beyond just your day-to-day job. So we want to make sure that we're communicating that context to the people in the world, right? And then we also want to talk about our particular culture. So each organization has its own unique culture. A culture is just, the way that we work together. It is how decisions get made. It is how people communicate about things. It is not necessarily, written down. I think, often it's very informal and you can kind of observe it, even if the organization has defined values. Sometimes those values do represent the culture and sometimes they don't. Sometimes what's actually happening is very different from the values that, are hanging on a poster on the wall. So it's important as we go through this process to really consider, honestly, what is our culture right now? And also, where does it need to go? So if, as we think about things like a hybrid work environment, this is an opportunity to recreate things that we have, mostly never had before, unless you've started an organization, right? Like this is a moment in time where we can really take the best of what's out there and bring that into our organizations and not just revert back to an old way of doing things. So we'll talk a little bit about, some ideas that are out there, and this is all pretty new, as well as a lot of folks have started going back into the office in some capacity, in the last 6 months in particular. So we will dive into the next worksheet too. I think that one thing that I like to highlight, particularly as we talk about culture, is stepping back to consider who has left our organization and why. Hopefully you have some information from things like exit interviews, whether they're formal or not, to give you a real sense of, the reasons people were leaving. I hope that people have been honest as they have been departing. Sometimes that doesn't happen, but I often find that, they don't have anything to lose at that point. So that's really important data. If that's not something that you've been collecting, I would really just encourage you to have someone who's more impartial be able to sit down with everybody who's leaving to ask some of those questions, because that is really important information to help you understand the patterns, the systems and structures that might be in people's way, the different things that are causing them to leave. It's usually not about money. It's usually about something else that's not working for them, whether it's a supervisor or, the structure of the organization itself. So as we think about bringing in more diversity, equity, and inclusion practices in our organization, this is a way of thinking about culture not as something that is static, that we only want to hire people who are like us. and moving to a place of how do we want our culture to stretch and grow, because we are not going to survive if we stay static as an organization. Those are the organizations that are bleeding people, is where they're not sort of stopping to have those harder conversations. And it can be scary. I know, from being the HR director that it can feel personal when people leave, or when there are things that are structurally not working, or we haven't fixed them yet, or we haven't built them yet. But it's important to, to sort of be as dispassionate as possible in processing that information and sort of looking for, how we can continue growing our organizations as we move forward. So I will go ahead and share the next page here. And we'll kind of talk through some of these questions on defining your culture. So the first piece is thinking about what qualities it takes to succeed in the culture. So this is, as I sort of described, each organization is a little bit different. What does it take to get things done? How do people work together? And what are the leaders modeling, whether it's intentional or not? So, the example I give here is that, a large legacy nonprofit that's been around for 100 years is very different than a startup organization or a sort of small, scrappy organization, right? Like, you can imagine those two different environments. Neither is good or bad, right? They are just different organizations. And I think, this is an important feature to consider in who we want to hire and who's going to actually, enjoy the culture. My first job was in a large legacy nonprofit, and, part of a national organization, and it was not a good fit for me, but I didn't know that going in. It was a great experience to be exposed to how hierarchical things were, not just within our office, but in terms of the national office, telling the regional office, telling the city office to do something that maybe didn't actually work for our city. But that was just the requirement because all the offices had to do this particular thing, right? So that, was a really interesting exercise for me in understanding, like, yeah, there are some people who probably love to be like, yep, okay, I'm going to go do what you tell me to do and do the same thing that everybody else is doing. That's not a good fit for me, right? And so when I found myself in a small entrepreneurial organization, I discovered, aha, this is what I love. Like, I love being in a place where I get to build something, where I can say, hey, I want to take on, Ulysses read off all the different jobs I've had. Like, most of those were in one organization, where I said, hey, can I go to Capitol Hill and do some lobbying? Can I write some grants? And yes, I could, because there was, a small team, and, that was the opportunity to jump in and do things like that. Right. So, but, you want someone who is comfortable with some uncertainty in that kind of environment. That's an important thing for, considering where your organization is on sort of the life cycle of organizations, is like, what is their comfort level of the folks that you're looking to hire? Are you a really stable organization? Because some people will be very attracted to that. Are things like up in the air and changing all the time? Like, other people, would like to run the other way. So consider those kinds of qualities and how you can describe that. And I'll share, some of those examples as I share the sample profile as we go along here too. So that's one aspect of the organizational culture, right? Is sort of the size or the structure of the organization, but also considering, like, are we an organization that is deep in DEI work right now? And so you need to be someone who is doing your own work in that space too. We need someone who's already been, doing some of their own processing or their own unpacking. So there's a whole wide range of examples there of the kinds of organization that we're talking about. As we get into this next question, so this is sort of to the point of exit interviews, thinking about people who haven't fit the culture is really, this opportunity to be introspective. What was the mismatch? Was it something like, oh, they were expecting a lot more structure and we just don't have it? Was it, that they did not feel welcome in the organization? And that's that's another set of things to unpack about how we can help help our new hires feel welcome or included in the organization. And, have you started making any changes as a result of, someone who maybe wasn't a fit, whether to, clarify some roles, whether to, really kind of think about creating a buddy system or a mentoring system or something like that. And I say all of this knowing that, you have limited time and resources, but these are important things to consider, not just what is our culture, but, who hasn't fit and what's going on there. So this gets into the third question of how do we need to grow and evolve our culture? You're not going to fix this problem tomorrow. Every culture needs to continue to grow and evolve, but it's important to consider, especially if you've had trouble attracting people to a particular role, are there some ways that we're holding on to a culture that may not be serving us anymore? So, what are some of the qualities that would help us, expand the culture that we're trying to build here? What are some of the elements that we are already doing that we can add on to if we had another advocate in that space? And, are we ready for that, right? I think that's an honest question to ask too, because, this is fundamentally about people changing jobs and careers and livelihoods. And so we don't want to take lightly that, we're trying to make some improvements in our organization, but we're maybe not fully there yet. We want to be honest about what they'll be walking into, because otherwise we're going to end up with them quitting and, have to start all over again. So I just really do encourage you to be honest about what's working, what's not working, and, how you're going to work on addressing that in some small but manageable ways. So, and then the last piece here is to look at why is this an exciting opportunity? I've mentioned that a couple of times, but let's make sure somewhere in your posting is talking about the impact that you're having in the community. And even if this position is a receptionist sitting behind a desk, how can you describe how their role contributes to or supports the impact of the organization? I think that is really meaningful to people, and gives them a sense that they're bigger. They're part of something bigger than themselves. And I think that as we get back into working a little bit in the way that we were before, a lot of people have quit their jobs or changed jobs in the last 2 years. And, this question of your why or what is meaningful to you is often one of the reasons that people have shifted gears, right? They don't want to put up with that anymore, or they, don't just want to, work for some big company. They want to feel like they're having some sort of impact in the world. And so here is your opportunity to sell that. And I use sell in a very particular way because that is part of what you need to do here, even if that sounds a little bit scary. So I will share in here. So here's a sample profile. As I mentioned, this is something I've created, so you're welcome to be inspired by this. I don't want to see this posted out there in the world, just verbatim, right? This is language I've developed over the years. But this is so that you get a sense of how all these pieces come together, both the culture piece and the role itself. So this is for a development assistant. The first paragraph is really about describing your impact. I have taken that part out because it was one of my clients, so we don't identify them here. Then the next paragraph describes how this particular development team was focusing their efforts on a sales-based approach. So not grant writing focus, not events focus, right? This is fundraising that is about getting out and talking to lots of people. So this development assistant is the person who, most people are going to connect with first, right? They are going to be that great person connecting with folks. We're being clear, this is a small team. This is a great learning opportunity. You don't have to have experience, right? We're trying to describe so that people can actually see themselves in the role if it's for them. This is an exciting position for someone who wants to build a career in fundraising and understand how it works. And then we get into some of these profile qualities. So who's going to succeed best in this role? Someone who loves supporting others, right? So as we talk about profile qualities, we want this person to not just be an administrative assistant, but someone who is like incredibly proactive, who loves like thinking about how they can take care of other people. So, in this example, like thinking about someone with customer service skills, who loves that kind of role, is a great fit, so translating skills across industries is really helpful. Feeling a sense of ownership, like seeing themselves as a partner, not just waiting for people to give them work, but, being proactive. And then something like a process thinker, like somebody who's always like, could we do that more efficiently? So you can see that what we're doing here is describing the kind of person that we're looking for. We're not saying we need XYZ experience or a college degree. We're saying, here's who is going to succeed in this role. And there's a couple other qualities here, like somebody who's a problem solver, somebody who's organized. This is one of my my favorite descriptions, because the number of times I've used this and had someone say, how did you know I made a spreadsheet for bird watching on my honeymoon? Or how did you know, like I had a binder that I gave everybody for my wedding? So you can be quirky in how you describe these things too. You don't have to be sort of like deep in legalistic HR language. That's not what this is about. This is a sales tool or a marketing tool, right? So be quirky so that you're hitting the people who are like, oh my gosh, you described me. That's amazing. And then we have a couple things like where you might have gotten some writing experience from, right? And then we have a limited set of responsibilities. You can see this is not the exhaustive list of everything, but what we want to do here in sharing the responsibilities is just to say, like, here's to give you a sense of what the focus of the role is going to be. As I mentioned, like 3, ideally there's 3. This one, had a couple of more discrete things that we needed to kind of communicate, but also we're communicating here that it's a new role. So this is going to change over time. So that can cover your HR bases, but for the purposes of marketing this position, we just want people to understand what their day-to-day would look like. We're going to post salary and benefits. This is something that from an equity standpoint is really important. And I know in New York City in, 3 weeks or 2 weeks on November 1st, you're going to have to legally post salary and benefits in your job posting. So this is part of the process of making sure that we're being transparent with candidates about what we really have available to pay. We're obviously not going to ask for salary history. We're going to ask them what they would like to get paid. So that's just part of that process here. And then, there's just a little like extra details towards the end there. So let me just pause sharing my screen. And just see, you've seen defining the role, defining the culture, and an example of what the profile looks like. So just feel free to throw out questions that you have. And Darby, I had a question, I think that came just to me about receiving a copy of the recording. Could you answer that question? Okay, Darby says yes, you will receive a copy of the recording. So, okay. All right. So I think that unless there are questions, I will get us to the last step of the process, which is how do we find people, actual human beings and not unicorns. I don't have a unicorn finder. So we will talk about a couple of things here. So one is sort of like the actual finding of people. And then, when you have applicants, what do you do with them so that you stay anchored in this process? So I'll talk about both of those things and make sure we have some time at the end for questions as well. So I think that for many years, posting on a bunch of job boards has been not the best strategy. It was something that worked 20 years ago, and I have been doing this a long time. And, over the last 10 years. Like it has, job boards, as much as they advertise all over every podcast I listen to and Super Bowl ads and whatever else, job boards are only for people who are actively looking for jobs. That might go without saying. And so, that's sort of the fundamental problem with them, is that we're only going to get a certain segment of people. We're not going to get the people who might be interested in leaving a job, but aren't sort of actively out there looking. So I'll talk about, sort of the best bang for your buck in that standpoint. I think that there's still a usefulness in doing a couple of postings, but knowing the limited budgets that most of you have, I don't want to see you spending hundreds and hundreds of dollars on sites that net you maybe a lot of volume, but not a lot of quality. And that, that's sort of the fundamental problem with sites like Indeed in particular, where you can post for free, and that's great. But then you're flooded with 50 or 100 applications of people who mostly haven't even looked at the job posting, because it's so easy for job seekers. But for organizations, especially ones where you don't have a dedicated HR department or recruiter, it is overwhelming. So I just want to encourage you to you can go smaller. So the idea of the process of developing the profile is that it gives you a tool to be able to reach out to your networks in a more powerful way than maybe you have in the past. And, looking at, some opportunities like through social media, primarily LinkedIn is going to be, one of the best places. And I have no, allegiance to them. I have no, I don't get compensated by them or anything. I just have tried all of the things. And I still do post on a couple of, selected websites, usually something that's like a nonprofit association, and also something that might be specific to the kind of skill set that we're looking for. So, is it like somebody with some fundraising experience or, some IT experience or something like that, right? So some place where we could cross-pollinate not just nonprofit folks, but also maybe some folks who are, in the rest of the world. So I do tend to do those kinds of things. But one thing that I have found to be incredibly useful is taking the profile. So you've already thought about what is the most important part of this role, or, maybe 3 parts. And then what are those profile qualities that would describe that person? So you can take those couple of things out of your profile and make it a really simple email to share with your board, with your networks, to, create a post on LinkedIn. Often posting in different groups on LinkedIn is a very helpful way of getting at the right kinds of folks as well. But I think, using LinkedIn as a way of, having your staff share out with their networks as well. Like that is often how people are finding out about opportunities, is when people in their network share them. Excuse me. So whether that's through an email, whether that's through, social media, whether it's through an old-fashioned phone call or a text, it doesn't, particularly matter. And I think that person-to-person contact is one of the best things you can do. Again, we're not going to get a lot of volume out of that, but we're going to get some quality candidates who actually, are coming from our network. The one sort of caveat to that is that sometimes our networks are not that diverse, right? Sometimes the networks are full of people who might look just like me. And so if I haven't really worked to develop my network over the years, that can, further reinforce a lack of diversity in the organization. So that's an important conversation to have with your staff, with your board, to really think creatively and make a specific ask of people. So I'd like you to think of 3 people who you can reach out to in your network so that we can get this to the widest possible set of eyes. So I think that is another great way to engage staff in this process too, is, give them some empowerment to help find the next team member, right? They're going to be working with them. It would be valuable for them to be enrolled in that process. And, when you're doing that kind of communication, you're just trying to make it short and compelling, and then they can always click on a link for more, right? You don't have to have everything in there. We're talking about, 3 or 4 sentences at most to kind of share with folks. So that's, a bit of what I would recommend in terms of like tapping into your networks. Beyond that, a couple of other resources I do like to share. Some additional kind of free sites that are a little bit more creative to reach folks who are sort of nonprofit inclined, that I often go to are returned Peace Corps volunteers and city or alumni. Those are 2 groups of folks who have like done some, national or international service, have built a lot of skills in their time in those kinds of roles, and are often, looking for opportunities elsewhere as they finish up that particular kind of service. So that's another set of resources that, I would encourage you to check out as well. Again, not a lot of volume that you're going to get out of that unless you're like in an international development space or kind of like specifically doing that kind of work. But, I often have found some really great folks from those networks as well. And the last thing I will highlight in terms of like where you might find people, and again, not sponsored by LinkedIn. This is sort of the best bang for your buck piece of this that I will mention. The LinkedIn job postings now are free. So they used to charge for that. You can still pay to upgrade, like most of those websites. So you can still post on LinkedIn. One of the things that I have found to be most valuable is to get what's called a recruiter light contract. And that's just like a monthly fee that you pay, and you can cancel it anytime. And usually they give you the first month free. It's about $160 now, I think. And what that enables you to do is some customized searches of people who are 3 degrees out from you. So you can go like quite far into your network and say, say I'm looking for a development director, and I'm going to say, I need someone in this particular region who has this kind of title. You can do all kinds of complex searches. And then, actually reach out to people, as I mentioned, who aren't actively looking for things. And you share the position, say, if you're interested, let me know, or please share it with your network, whatever it might be. And again, you're not going to get 50 people from that, but I have consistently found, probably 10% of the people I contact that way do respond and are interested. And sometimes we've hired those folks. And, so that's just, it's almost like cold calling, but you're doing it over email. So it may not feel so scary. And it's just one of the other ways that you can diversify your networks. If your own organization's networks are not that diverse, here's a way of reaching other folks in your area in particular. So those are a couple strategies. We've talked a little bit about sort of creative ways to fill solutions or interim strategies as well. Is there somebody on your team who actually does have most of the qualities you've outlined? That's always worth considering before you kind of get out there and post that. Sometimes you realize it after you've posted it, and that's okay too. But I just encourage you, if you have internal candidates, to handle them respectfully and honestly. And, if they're not really a fit, to be honest with them about why or how they might grow into that role, or consider taking a chance. That's a conversation I've had with many folks that, when you have an internal candidate, say even to become the next executive director, they may not yet have the skill set that the previous ED had. But would it be more painful to lose that person and the institutional knowledge if that person wants to stay and lead? That would be more costly than, say, hiring an executive coach to make sure that person gets the support they need to take on a new role. So, sometimes finding someone internally is the best option, and sort of using your resources to, support them and help them get some training, rather than, trying to spend all kinds of money trying to sign somebody new or going through a very lengthy hiring process, right? So I do really consider those options as well. Let's see, and I think we've covered I sort of highlighted a little bit volunteers as another strategy. The only thing I like to mention about volunteers is they need to be managed just like staff people do. So they need to have really clear expectations. They can't just run off and do their own thing. And they need to have accountability too. So you kind of have to, have a particular way of managing them if they're going to fill a role, short term or in the interim. And then the last thing I will talk about here is, so once you have some candidates, how do you process them? How do you have conversations with them? Because we, generally have a fairly short process to try to understand who these people are. Are they going to fit in the organization? Do they like us? And I will share my screen in a minute too, so you can see some of these other questions. So I think the most important thing to think about as you move into the actual process of engaging with candidates is to go back to the profile. The profile is your anchor for who you're looking for. So when you're sitting down to look through resumes, let's have the profile right there so that we're accurately assessing people as objectively as we can, even though it's always subjective. Let's assess people against the profile qualities that we have, create a spreadsheet and kind of gauge them. I generally don't find a rating system is super helpful because a 5 to you is different than a 5 to me. So we just need to kind of be honest about, the qualitative things that we're seeing as opposed to getting specific about, you're a 1 and you're a 2. But really consider, how does each candidate match up against the profile that we've set out? And through that process, you're going to start to understand, maybe some of those profile qualities are going to rise to the top when you see the actual candidates out there. You might say, okay, like we were looking for these 3 things. This group of candidates has 2 of those things that are most important. So maybe that 3rd one is less critical to us as we move forward here. So just know that there's some give and take as you get into this process that, you need to iterate a little bit when you see actual human beings, right? So we always start this process in theory and then move to reality and want to understand who's out there. And then we, as we get into the interviewing process, there are a couple things I'll highlight for you. The most important thing is that this is a 2-way process. This is not you're there to test them and stump them with weird interview questions, or like get upset if they didn't answer it exactly the way you wanted to, right? This is, a mutual process of getting to know each other, much like dating, right? Like it is serious. It is about people making major life choices. So we need to be respectful of that. So not drag them through 50 rounds of interviews, but really think carefully about what it is we're looking to find out from them. And excuse me, and making sure that there is time for them to ask questions of us and give honest answers to those questions. So this is a transparent process. We're not hiding things. We're not pretending like we're perfect. You're naturally going to be more enthusiastic about your organization, but it's important to say yeah, and we're working on these things, right? And then as we ask interview questions, we want to make sure that we're not looking for right answers. We're looking for how people think. We're looking for how people interact. We're also particularly, trying to avoid the biases that we bring to these processes. And all of us have biases in interview processes because we are humans. So if you're noticing you really like the person that you're interviewing, or oh, they remind me of me when I was younger, those are some flags to go off in your head just to say, okay, I need to step back so that I can be more objective here and just note that I have some biases, towards or against these people, and try to remove those as much as possible from the process. That's an ongoing process and practice to work on. But as you develop your interview questions, going again to the profile is where you're going to be able to anchor yourself. So if you're looking for someone who has that experience and love of engaging donors or contacts and isn't afraid to to make an ask, asking some questions about, when they have done those things in the past, like when was a time you found a new account or a new donor? How did you engage them? How did you find them? How did you get them through to making an ask? Tell me that whole story, right? So that's an example of a situational question, which helps us to understand how people have done in similar environments when that's relevant to the position. And so those are much better interview questions to ask than theoretical ones about like, what would you do if you were in, this situation? Because they may not know enough about our organization or the dynamics at play to have a good answer to that question. So, really allowing people to draw from their own experience is going to be the most valuable information that you can get from them. And then the other thing I'll just mention, that is an option to really consider how you assess people in real life is to think about, are there some creative things you could add to your process that are less about interviews where not everybody shows up perfectly, and maybe more about doing some similar work. And, this could be a really brief kind of writing assignment. I'm not talking about something really comprehensive here, but so like giving someone 24 hours to draft an email that they would send to a donor, for example. So we're not talking about like a huge amount of work, but it's enough time to actually see their writing in a normal way, not like give me a writing sample that you don't know who's contributed to, or like you could think about, is there, some research or some project management that you would like to see, kind of how they would approach something like that. So think about a problem that position has to deal with. That might be interesting to see, what they actually would do. The one thing I will add to that point is that, it is from an equity standpoint, asking people to do some work for you for free. So I would really consider, some compensation as part of that kind of process, especially if you're asking for something more involved. But, I think that there are some really simple kind of quick ways that you could do that, perhaps in lieu of an additional interview, where you might have, 2 or 3 interviews and, a short assessment of that kind of thing. So that's a common way in the tech sector that people are tested out, as programmers, is they're paid to, to come on and do a project or work on a project for a little while. So, it's harder for us, in our sector to find more discrete ways for people to contribute like that. But I think, we're not asking people to do work that isn't yet done. It's about asking them to show us kind of how they think about something without, too much pressure to kind of do it right on the spot. So that is another way that you can kind of assess how folks are, going to show up when they actually start the job as well. So all of that is on the last, everything I've just talked through is on the last page of the worksheet that you'll have access to. So I will just wrap us up there in terms of my talking, and just invite any other questions that, you've been a quiet group. So if you have questions at this point, now's the time to ask them. If there's some things you mentioned I didn't cover, please do let me know. And that does remind me, the hybrid work piece I was meaning to come back to again too. So, one thing I really kind of, that I encourage organizations to do at this point is to consider that everything is on the table to, in terms of how we work. Everything's on the table to consider keeping or getting rid of. And that is a place to engage the staff in a really deep way. There may be some requirements of the work that you do that require you to be in person. Does it have to be 5 days a week now, 40 hours a week? I don't know. I kind of doubt it. There's certainly like a homeless shelter that does have to operate, but are there some ways that we could give people some respite away from the day-to-day so that they do have a little bit of time to step back and reflect and recharge? So I think that there's a lot of work out there. There have been, a number of podcasts that Adam Grant has done, in particular about coming back to work and reframing some of that. And maybe I will actually add that to the worksheet as a link, because that came out pretty recently. I hadn't added that here, but that just gave some really great questions to consider about the virtual space is as much of an office space as our physical space. And so these are both tools at our disposal, being physically present and being virtually present. And so what are we looking to get out of these different situations? It may not be that we're just trying to all be back at the office and we want everyone to be there because we want that sense of camaraderie. That might be important to many of us at this point. But what is the real reason that we would need to be together? What meetings could be emails, for example, right? Or, how do we help people prepare for meetings so we can actually make them decision-making locations, not, just reporting out about things, for example, right? So I think as you really think about the culture going forward and what a hybrid office might look like, how are we making the connections that are really important as humans, but maybe letting go of some of the stuff that isn't as critical to our day-to-day. So I know I've had a lot to share with you, and would love to hear any other questions or something that you're taking away from today. If you want to share that in the chat, that would be great to see, and I can turn it over to the team here to close us out.
Jessica, thank you so much for today's presentation. If anyone does have any final questions or comments, I know, Jessica, we can share your information later if you'd like. And we'd like to say thank you so much once again, everyone who came here today. Everyone, I know it's busy, so appreciate everyone coming in. And Jessica, thank you so much for your time and for sharing your insight with us today. And one final note, if you'd like the materials from today, please fill out. There is a survey in your inbox. It should be there now. I just sent it. So if you send that out, we will get you the materials on Friday and send you everything that we talked about today, including the recording. So once again, thank you. And thank you. I see some people are sharing some things they took away. So we'll leave it open for just a moment and then we'll close out. But thank you, everyone, once again. And thank you, Jessica.
Thanks, everyone, for being here.
All right. Have a great day, everyone.